The email arrived at 9:17 a.m. on a Friday. 3 sentences that shattered Kendra Taylor's world. Your position has been terminated. Effective immediately. Please clear your desk by noon. Security will escort you out. After 7 years of dedication, 60-hour work weeks, and missing his daughter's soccer games to meet deadlines, Kendrick was discarded like yesterday's newspaper. He stared at the screen, reading it 3 times before the reality sank in. 7 years at Crestline Technologies, gone in an instant. His hands trembled slightly as he minimized the message and glanced at the photo of his 10-year-old daughter, Amara, that served as his desktop background. Her gap-toothed smile, usually a source of comfort during stressful work days, now filled him with a particular kind of dread that settled into his bones like cold water. How would he tell her? How would he pay the mortgage on their modest 2-bedroom apartment over on Langston Avenue? How would he afford her asthma medication, the one that cost $200 a month, even with insurance? The marketing department buzzed with the usual Friday morning energy around him. His colleagues typed away at keyboards, sipped coffee from ceramic mugs with ironic slogans, and chatted about weekend plans, completely oblivious to the bomb that had just detonated his life. Kendrick took a deep breath that didn't quite fill his lungs and opened his desk drawer, pulling out a small stress ball Amara had given him for his birthday last year. It was purple with gold stars, her favorite colors, and she'd written on it in permanent marker that had already started to fade. "For when work gets crazy, Daddy," she'd said, presenting it to him with the seriousness of someone bestowing a sacred artifact. He squeezed it hard, feeling the foam compress under his fingers, and tried to think clearly through the fog of panic settling over his mind. Kendrick had grown up on the south side of Ashford Heights, raised by his grandmother after his mother passed when he was 6, and his father disappeared into a cycle of addiction that eventually took his life too. Grandma Lucille had worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, cleaning offices downtown during the day and doing laundry for the Henderson family on weekends. She'd pressed the importance of education and hard work into him like an iron on Sunday shirts, and he'd taken those lessons to heart. Scholarship to Whitfield State University, degree in marketing with a minor in computer science, and a career that had slowly but steadily carried him from entry-level coordinator to senior integration specialist at one of the city's most prominent tech firms. Everything he'd built, every rung he'd climbed, had been for the people who believed in him and for the daughter who depended on him. Now he was staring at an email that reduced all of it to 3 cold sentences. 20 floors above, in a corner office that occupied more square footage than Kendrick's entire apartment, Camille Okafor reviewed the quarterly projections with a deepening frown. At 42, she'd built Crestline Technologies from a startup operating out of her cousin's garage in the Drexel Park neighborhood to a $200 million company in just over a decade. The sleek glass and steel corner office with its panoramic view of the Ashford Heights skyline was a daily reminder of how far she'd come from the girl who'd grown up sharing a bedroom with 3 siblings in a cramped house on Birchwood Street. Her father, a Ghanaian immigrant who'd driven a taxi for 30 years, had died believing his daughter would change the world. Some days, surrounded by the evidence of her success, she believed it too. But the numbers on her screen threatened everything she'd built, and the weight of that threat pressed down on her shoulders like hands trying to push her underwater. "The cuts have been implemented as directed," said Terrence Mitchell, her CFO, standing stiffly by her desk in a charcoal suit that fit him like a uniform. Terrence was meticulous, reliable, and utterly devoid of sentimentality when it came to the bottom line. He'd been with Camille since the early days, back when payroll meant writing checks by hand and praying they didn't bounce. His loyalty was unquestionable, but his perspective had narrowed over the years, becoming as rigid as the spreadsheets he lived inside. 32 employees terminated this morning, including all the redundancies in marketing we identified. Camille nodded without looking up, her eyes scanning columns of numbers that told a story of a company approaching a cliff. Revenue was down 11% year over year. 3 major clients had reduced their contracts. The new product line was behind schedule and over budget. And the Avalon contract? Any movement? Still pending. Their board meets Monday to make the final decision. The Avalon deal was everything. A $50 million contract with Avalon Dynamics, the largest healthcare technology company in the region, that would keep Crestline afloat through the economic downturn and fund their next generation of products. Without it, the company would start hemorrhaging cash within months, and the 32 people they'd let go this morning would be just the beginning of a much larger bloodletting. They're still concerned about the integration with their legacy systems, Terrence added, adjusting his glasses in the way he did when delivering news he knew she wouldn't want to hear. Their technical team has questions our people haven't been able to answer satisfactorily. I've been told the responses we sent last week were, and I'm quoting their lead architect here, incomplete and concerning. Camille finally looked up from her screen, and Terrence took an involuntary half-step backward. He'd known her long enough to recognize the particular intensity in her dark eyes that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Give me those questions. Every single one of them. I'll review them myself this weekend if I have to. I'll have them on your desk within the hour. Back on the 20th floor, Kendrick methodically placed his belongings into a cardboard box that someone from facilities had apparently left by his desk while he was reading the email, a detail that struck him as particularly cruel in its premeditation. They'd known. They planned this. While he was staying late last Tuesday to finish the integration reports, someone was ordering a cardboard box for his departure. He placed items carefully, as if the way he packed could impose order on the chaos of the moment. A coffee mug Amara had painted at one of those pottery places in the Millbrook shopping district, his name rendered in wobbly purple letters surrounded by stars and hearts. A small cactus named Gerald that had somehow survived 3 years under the fluorescent lights, requiring nothing from him but occasional water and the willingness not to give up on something that looked perpetually on the verge of dying. Awards for marketing campaigns that had helped build Crestline's reputation in the healthcare technology sector, plaques and certificates that now felt like participation trophies from a game he hadn't known he was losing. His throat tightened as he reached for the framed photo of Amara on her first day of kindergarten. She'd been wearing a yellow dress with white flowers, her hair in 2 perfect puffs that his grandmother had done that morning, because Kendrick's attempts at hair styling still resulted in what Amara diplomatically called creative. In the photo, she was standing on the front steps of Carver Elementary with her backpack nearly as big as she was, grinning at the camera with the fearless confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world could be unkind. "Kendrick, what are you doing?" He looked up to see Janelle Washington, his team lead, standing by his cubicle with confusion written across her face. Janelle was sharp, direct, and fiercely protective of her team. She'd been the one to advocate for his promotion 2 years ago, and they developed the kind of professional friendship that sometimes spilled over into genuine caring. The kind where she'd text him recipes for meals a single dad could make in under 30 minutes, and he'd send her articles about management strategies he thought she'd find useful. "Didn't you get the memo?" he asked, his voice hollow in a way that made him wince internally. He sounded like a man already defeated, and Grandma Lucille hadn't raised a man who accepted defeat without a fight. But in this moment, with the box in front of him and the security guard he could see hovering near the department entrance, fighting felt like trying to punch fog. "I've been let go," he said. Janelle's eyes widened. "What? That's impossible. There must be some mistake." Kendrick handed her his phone with the email displayed. Her face fell as she read it, her expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked like guilt, though she had no reason to feel it. "This makes no sense," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You're our lead on the Avalon project. You designed the entire integration strategy. You're the only person on this team, probably in this whole company, who understands both our technical architecture and Avalon's legacy systems." "I wasn't consulted about this at all." Kendrick shrugged, tried to maintain his composure, even as something hot and tight built behind his sternum. "Apparently I'm redundant." The word tasted bitter. Redundant. As if the thousands of hours he'd poured into this company, the relationships he'd built with clients, the institutional knowledge that lived only in his head, could be replicated by rearranging a spreadsheet. Janelle shook her head, her expression hardening into the one Kendrick recognized from meetings where someone tried to take credit for her team's work. "Wait here. I'm going to talk to HR. This is wrong, and they need to know it." But Kendrick knew it wouldn't matter. Corporate decisions like this weren't reversed because a team lead protested. He'd seen it happen to others over the years. Good people who disappeared overnight, their desks empty on Monday morning, their names becoming awkward gaps in conversation that everyone navigated around like furniture that had been rearranged in a familiar room. Last year, it had been Dennis Palmer, a developer who'd been with the company since year 2. 3 months before that, it was Yolanda Banks from accounting, who'd missed one day of work in 11 years and was let go while she was at her son's college orientation. Each time, Kendrick had felt a pang of sympathy and a private relief that it wasn't him. Now it was him, and he understood with sudden clarity that the pang of sympathy he'd felt for others had been woefully inadequate. He continued packing while Janelle stormed off toward the HR department, her heels striking the floor with the percussive authority of someone preparing to make a scene. A security guard, a young brother named Deshaun, who Kendrick had chatted with in the lobby 100 times, appeared at the entrance to the marketing department. Deshaun's face was a study in discomfort, his eyes finding everything in the room to look at except Kendrick. He was there for him, Kendrick knew, the final indignity, being escorted out like a criminal by someone who'd once asked him for advice about proposing to his girlfriend. On the top floor, Camille's meeting with the executive team was interrupted by an urgent call. "Miss Okafor, I have the CTO from Avalon on line 1. Her assistant Rochelle's voice announced through the intercom with the careful neutrality she used when delivering news that could go either way. He says it's regarding their final technical review." Camille excused herself from the conference table, where Terrence and the other executives exchanged uneasy glances, and took the call in her private office, closing the door behind her. "Solomon, good to hear from you. I was just reviewing the integration timeline." "Camille." Solomon Adeyemi's voice was serious, carrying none of the warmth that usually characterized their conversations. They'd known each other for years, having crossed paths at industry conferences and black tech networking events where they were often among the few people in the room who looked like them. That shared experience had built a professional friendship that Camille valued, which made the tone of his voice all the more alarming. "We've completed our technical assessment, and we have concerns. Major concerns." Camille's stomach tightened. "What kind of concerns?" "Your team's responses to our integration questions were inadequate. We need detailed answers about how your system will interface with our proprietary database architecture. The documentation we received is missing critical components. Specifically, we need to understand how you'll handle our custom patient data indexing, the real-time synchronization protocols, and the fail-safe mechanisms for our legacy backup systems. What you sent us reads like it was written by someone who's never actually looked at our infrastructure. I'm sure we can address any gaps," Camille said smoothly, though her mind was racing through the implications. "Why don't I have our technical lead reach out today?" "Camille, I'll be blunt." Solomon's voice carried the weight of someone who was about to deliver bad news and respected her enough to do it directly. "Our board meets Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern. Without satisfactory answers to these questions by Sunday night, I can't recommend moving forward with Crestline. And I need you to understand something. I'm the strongest advocate you have at Avalon. There are board members who want to go with Meridian Dynamics instead. If I can't walk in Monday morning with ironclad technical documentation, I won't be able to hold them off." The call ended with Solomon's words echoing in the silence of her office. Camille sat very still for exactly 4 seconds, the amount of time she allowed herself for panic before her mind shifted into problem-solving mode. She immediately summoned her CTO, Byron Caldwell, who appeared at her door within minutes, his expression already suggesting he knew something was wrong. "Who's handling the technical documentation for Avalon?" she demanded. Byron shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his large frame seeming to shrink under her gaze. "That would be Kendrick Taylor from marketing. He's been the liaison between our development team and their technical staff for the past 8 months. He understands both the technical aspects and can translate them for the business side. He's been in direct contact with Avalon's database architects, built relationships with their whole team. Actually, get him up here. Now." Byron hesitated, and in that hesitation, Camille saw the shape of a problem she hadn't anticipated. "That might be difficult," he said carefully. "I believe Kendrick was on the reduction list this morning." Camille stared at him. The silence in the room became a physical thing, pressing against the walls. What? The marketing department had to cut 4 positions. I believe he was one of them. The redundancy assessment team flagged his role as overlapping with the general marketing coordinator position. Who made that decision? Camille's voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that her executive team had learned to fear more than shouting. It came from the redundancy assessment team. Terrence signed off on the final list. Camille grabbed her phone and called HR directly, bypassing Rochelle entirely. Is Kendra Taylor still in the building? Let me check, the HR director, Patricia Osei, replied. After a moment that felt like it lasted the length of Camille's entire career, she came back on the line. Security is escorting him out now. He should be in the lobby. Stop them. Immediately. Do not let that man leave this building. In the lobby, Kendrick stood with his box of belongings, waiting for Deshawn to finish processing his exit paperwork. His company badge sat on the security desk, already deactivated, a small rectangle of plastic that had represented his identity for 7 years reduced to a piece of expired technology. He felt numb, his mind racing through calculations of how long his modest savings would last. 2 months, maybe 3 if he cut everything to the bone. What bills could be delayed? What expenses could be cut? Amara's dance classes would have to go. The field trip to the Science Museum next month, already paid for at least. Groceries could be stretched. He'd grown up on rice and beans and Grandma Lucille's ability to make something out of nothing, and he could do the same for his daughter if he had to. Mr. Taylor. A voice called from across the lobby. He turned to see Camille Okafor herself striding toward him, her heels clicking authoritatively on a marble floor with the rhythm of someone accustomed to the world rearranging itself around her movement. Kendrick had only met the CEO a handful of times in 7 years, mostly at company-wide meetings where she addressed the staff from a podium with the practiced charisma of someone who'd learned to command rooms full of people who didn't always expect to take direction from a black woman. Up close, he could see the intensity in her dark eyes that had built crestline from nothing, and something else too. Something that might have been urgency or worry, or the particular expression of someone who just realized they'd made a serious mistake. Miss Okafor, he acknowledged, shifting his box awkwardly. Gerald the cactus tilted dangerously. There's been a mistake, she said without preamble. Her voice carried the authority of someone who was used to declarations being accepted as fact, but there was a tightness around her eyes that undermined the smoothness of her delivery. Your termination was an error. We need you to come back upstairs immediately. Kendrick stared at her. The lobby felt suddenly very large and very quiet, despite the usual Friday morning traffic of people entering and exiting the building. Deshawn had stopped his paperwork and was watching the exchange with wide eyes. An error, Kendrick repeated. Yes, a significant one. She glanced at Deshawn. Please reactivate Mr. Taylor's credentials. Kendrick felt a surge of conflicting emotions that crashed through his numbness like waves breaking against a seawall. Relief that he wasn't jobless, hot and immediate and almost dizzying. Anger at being discarded so easily, rising right behind the relief like heat following lightning. And underneath both, a deep, bone-level suspicion about the sudden reversal that his grandmother would have called the Lord telling you to pay attention. May I ask what changed in the last hour? He asked carefully, keeping his voice neutral even as his pulse hammered in his ears. Camille hesitated, and in that hesitation Kendrick saw something he'd never expected to see from the woman who'd built a tech empire from scratch. Discomfort. She was clearly unaccustomed to explaining herself, to standing in a lobby asking someone to undo a decision her company had made. The dynamic between them had shifted in a way neither of them fully understood yet, but they could both feel it, the way you could feel a change in air pressure before a storm. I've just learned you're essential to the Avalon project, she said. Your termination was not properly vetted through the right channels. Kendrick set his box down on the security desk. Gerald the cactus settled upright again. With all due respect, Miss Okafor, I don't think I can just pretend this morning didn't happen. I was fired by email. 3 sentences after 7 years of service. No conversación. No warning. No acknowledgement of anything I've contributed. I found out I was losing my livelihood the same way I'd find out about a schedule change. Camille's expression tightened. She glanced around the lobby, aware that they were creating a scene. Several employees had slowed their walks to and from the elevators, pretending not to listen while very clearly listening. "Let's discuss this privately," she said. "Please." The please landed differently than the rest of her words. It wasn't a command dressed in politeness. It was a genuine request from someone who recognized she was asking for something she hadn't earned. Upstairs, in the corner office with its panoramic view that now felt more like a cage than a trophy, Camille explained the situation with uncharacteristic candor. The Avalon contract was in jeopardy. Without Kendrick's knowledge of both the technical integration and Avalon's specific concerns, they would lose the deal. Without the deal, Crestline would face layoffs far beyond the 32 employees cut that morning. The dominoes would fall. The company that had been her father's dream and her life's work would begin to crumble. "So, I'm suddenly valuable because you realized you need me," Kendrick said flatly. He sat across from her desk in a chair that probably cost more than his couch at home, his box of belongings sitting on the floor between them like evidence at a trial. "Yes," Camille admitted. "I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." Something in her directness gave him pause. He'd expected corporate doublespeak, the kind of carefully constructed language designed to obscure responsibility and reframe exploitation as opportunity. Instead, she'd simply told the truth, and the truth, raw and unvarnished, created a small opening in the wall of anger he'd been building all morning. Kendrick looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere out there, 10 blocks east and 4 blocks south, was Carver Elementary, where Amara was probably working on multiplication tables or drawing pictures of horses, which she'd been obsessed with lately, blissfully unaware that her father's ability to provide for her had been threatened and then partially restored in the span of an hour. "I have a daughter," he said finally, turning back to Camille. "She's 10. Her mother left when she was 3, packed a bag one Tuesday afternoon while Amara was at daycare and was gone before I got home from work. Left a note on the kitchen counter that said she wasn't cut out for this. It's just been the two of us since then. Every decision I make affects her directly. Every risk I take, she bears the consequences of." Camille nodded, her expression unreadable, but her eyes attentive in a way that suggested she was actually listening rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. "This morning, before you walked across that lobby, I had to think about telling her we might need to move. That she might need to change schools, leave her friends, give up dance classes. I had to think about what would happen if she had an asthma attack, and I couldn't afford her medication because my insurance evaporated with a 3-sentence email." His voice remained steady, controlled, but the emotion behind it filled the room like something you could touch. "I had to think about whether I'd have to ask my grandmother, who is 78 years old and still cleaning other people's houses, to help me make rent." "What are you saying?" Camille asked quietly. "I'm saying I'll help with the Avalon project. Because I care about what we do here, and because 32 people already lost their jobs this morning, and I don't want to be responsible for hundreds more losing theirs. But I need guarantees. A 2-year contract minimum. I want to lead the integration team going forward with appropriate compensation that reflects my actual value, not the value your redundancy assessment team assigned to a line on a spreadsheet." Camille studied him across her desk. In 12 years of building her company, navigating hostile investors, skeptical clients, and an industry that often looked at her with barely concealed surprise that she was the one in charge, she'd rarely been cornered like this. But she recognized the position she was in, and more importantly, she recognized the position she'd put him in. She thought about her father, driving that taxi through Ashford Heights for 30 years, coming home exhausted but dignified, never once complaining about the passengers who questioned his English or the ones who didn't tip. He'd taught her that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned by giving it first. "Done," she said. "I'll have legal draw up the paperwork today. And Kendrick, I am sorry. Not just because we need you, but because what happened this morning was wrong." Over the next 48 hours, Kendrick worked almost nonstop, fueled by coffee from a break room. takeout from Mama Claudette's Caribbean restaurant on Fulton Street, and the focused determination of someone who understood that his performance over the next 2 days would determine not just his future, but the futures of hundreds of colleagues. He set up a temporary command center in the large conference room on the 18th floor, spreading technical documents across the table and filling whiteboards with integration diagrams that mapped the complex relationship between Crestline's systems and Avalon's proprietary infrastructure. He coordinated with Crestline's development team, pulling in Darius Webb from backend architecture and Nina Okonkwo from database management, both of whom gave up their weekends without complaint when Kendrick explained what was at stake. Together, they addressed Avalon's concerns one by one, working through the specific questions that Solomon Adeyemi had raised with the meticulous attention of surgeons operating on a patient they intended to save. Kendrick knew the integration challenges intimately. He'd been working on them for months, staying late after everyone else had gone home, reading technical manuals that weren't part of his job description, building relationships with Avalon's technical staff through patient conversations that went far beyond the formal requirements of his role. He'd anticipated questions before they were asked, identified potential failure points that Crestline's own development team had missed, and constructed solutions that bridged the gap between two very different technological ecosystems. By Sunday evening, operating on approximately 6 hours of total sleep over 2 days, he had compiled comprehensive documentation that addressed every issue Solomon had raised. 47 pages of technical specifications, integration protocols, fail-safe mechanisms, and implementation timelines, accompanied by diagrams that made complex systems comprehensible to both engineers and executives. Camille reviewed it personally before it was sent to Avalon, sitting across from Kendrick in the conference room at 9 p.m. on a Sunday night, both of them running on determination and the last of Mama Claudette's jerk chicken. "How did you know they would ask about these specific database architecture concerns?" she asked, looking up from the document with genuine curiosity. "Our development team didn't flag these as potential issues." Kendrick shrugged, though the answer wasn't as casual as the gesture suggested. "I listened. When I met with their database administrators last month, a woman named Keisha Hartwell and her team lead, Robert Adesanya, they mentioned their custom patient data indexing system. It wasn't an official part of the discussion, just something they were proud of, a system they'd built in-house over 7 years. But I knew it would be a potential integration challenge, so I spent 3 weekends researching solutions. Read everything I could find about similar systems, talked to a former colleague who dealt with comparable architecture at another healthcare company, even called a professor from Whitfield State who'd published a paper on legacy database integration." Camille nodded slowly, and Kendrick could see something shifting behind her eyes. She was seeing him differently, not as a marketing employee who could be quantified on a spreadsheet, but as something more complex and more valuable. This wasn't just technical knowledge. It was emotional intelligence, relationship building, and the kind of foresight that couldn't be taught in any MBA program or quantified by any redundancy assessment. "You did all of that on your own time?" she asked. "The project mattered to me. The people at Avalon mattered to me. When you build relationships with people, you don't want to let them down." Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, the city wrapped in the kind of low clouds that made the buildings look like they were dissolving into the sky. Kendrick was at his desk by 7, though he'd barely slept, running on adrenaline and the particular anxiety of someone who'd staked everything on a single hand. At 10:47 a.m., Solomon Adeyemi called Camille personally. "The board meeting just concluded," he said, and Camille could hear the smile in his voice before he delivered the words. "The contract is yours. $50 million over 3 years. Your documentation addressed every concern, and quite frankly, it impressed our technical team more than anything they've seen from a potential partner. Robert Adesanya specifically asked me to convey his compliments to whoever prepared the database integration protocols. He said it was the first time a vendor had actually understood their system rather than just promising they could handle it." Solomon paused, then added with the familiarity of an old friend rather than a business associate, "Whatever you're paying that integration specialist of yours, it's not enough." After the call, Camille found Kendrick in the conference room where he'd spent most of the weekend, gathering his materials with the careful deliberateness of someone who was too exhausted for any movement that wasn't intentional. The whiteboards were still covered in his integration diagrams, and the table was littered with coffee cups and food containers for Mama Claudette's. Avalon approved the contract, she told him, standing in the doorway. $50 million over 3 years. You just saved this company. Kendrick nodded, too exhausted for celebration. The relief was there, enormous and overwhelming, but it was buried under layers of fatigue and the emotional residue of a weekend that had tested everything he had. I'm glad. I believe in what we do here. I owe you an apology, Camille said, and the words were clearly unfamiliar on her tongue, shaped carefully as if she was speaking a language she'd learned late in life. Not just for the termination error, but for not recognizing your value sooner. For building a company that could make a decision like that, firing someone like you, and not have anyone in leadership question it until it was almost too late. Thank you, Kendrick said simply. The contract I promised you is ready. 2 years, leading the integration team, with a substantial raise and full benefits starting immediately. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Kendrick saw the woman behind the CEO, the one who'd grown up on Birchwood Street and still carried her father's dreams on her shoulders. But I'd like to offer you something else instead. Kendrick raised an eyebrow. I want to create a new position. Chief Integration Officer, overseeing not just Avalon, but all our major client integrations going forward. Reporting directly to me. 3-year contract, executive compensation package, and flexibility for your daughter's needs, including the understanding that her soccer games and dance recitals are not optional conflicts, but priorities that this company will respect. Kendrick was stunned. He searched her face for the catch, the corporate fine print that would undermine the generosity of the offer, but found only sincerity and something that might have been her own form of redemption. Why, he asked. Because this weekend showed me something critical about Crestline, Camille said, moving into the room and sitting across from him at the table cluttered with the evidence of his dedication. We've been focused on technology and growth, on numbers and projections and market share, but we've overlooked the human connections that make technology valuable. A $50 million contract was saved not by better code or faster processors, but by one person who took the time to listen to another person talk about something they were proud of. You understand both sides, the technology and the humanity. We need that perspective at the executive level. Frankly, we've needed it for years, and I was too focused on the spreadsheets to see it. 2 months later, Kendrick sat in his new office on the executive floor reviewing the integration roadmap for Crestline's newest client. The office was modest by executive standards. He'd specifically requested something smaller than the standard corner suite, saying he didn't need a view to do good work. But it was his, with his name on a brass plate outside the door that Amara had insisted on photographing and sending to every relative she could think of, including Grandma Lucille, who'd called him crying and saying his grandfather would have been so proud. On his desk sat the same photo of Amara from kindergarten, now joined by a newer one. Amara at her dance recital the previous weekend, caught mid-leap in her purple leotard, her face lit with the particular joy of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. Kendrick had attended without having to check his email once, without worrying about missing an important call, without the gnawing guilt that had accompanied every personal moment during his previous 7 years at the company. His phone buzzed with a text from Camille. Executive meeting in 10. Bringing Amara's cookies for the team. Kendrick smiled. 3 weeks ago, Amara had decided she wanted to bake cookies for Daddy's work friends, and he brought in 3 dozen chocolate chip cookies that disappeared within minutes. Camille had eaten 4, declaring them the best she'd ever had, and had been dropping hints about a repeat ever since. The company had changed in subtle but significant ways since his near departure. Camille had instituted what she called a human impact review for all major personnel decisions, requiring that any termination be evaluated not just for its financial implications, but for its effect on the employee, their family, their team, and the institutional knowledge that would be lost. The remaining employees who had been on that Friday's termination list had been individually reassessed. Most were reassigned to positions that better utilized their skills. 3 were offered severance packages that actually reflected their years of service. And Camille had made a point of personally meeting with each one, Not to apologize, though she did that too, but to understand what they did, what they knew, and what the company had almost thrown away. She'd also started holding monthly town halls that were less about corporate messaging and more about genuine conversation. Employees asked real questions and received real answers. Concerns were documented and followed up on. The culture hadn't transformed overnight. Cultures never did. But the direction had shifted, like a ship adjusting its course by a few degrees, small changes that would compound over time into a fundamentally different destination. For her part, Camille had learned the most valuable lesson of her career, that sometimes the most important asset in a company isn't found on any balance sheet. It's the human connection, the understanding, and the perspective that comes from seeing people as whole individuals with lives and responsibilities and dreams and daughters who make painted coffee mugs and stress balls with gold stars. She thought about her father often these days, more often than she had in years. About the dignity he'd maintained driving that taxi, about the way he'd treated every passenger as a person worthy of respect regardless of how they treated him. She'd built her company on intelligence and determination and an iron will, but she'd forgotten the foundation her father had laid. That success meant nothing if it required you to stop seeing people. As Kendrick gathered his materials for the meeting, straightening his tie and checking his reflection in the small mirror Amara had insisted he hang on the back of his door, so you can make sure you look handsome, Daddy. He glanced at a small frame on his credenza. Inside, it was a printed copy of that 3-sentence termination email, preserved behind glass like an artifact in a museum. Janelle had thought he was crazy when he'd framed it. Amara had asked why he'd want to keep something that made him sad. But it wasn't about sadness. It was a reminder of how quickly life could change, of how a person's entire value could be reduced to a line on a spreadsheet by someone who'd never taken the time to understand what that line represented, and of how resilience, the stubborn refusal to accept that your worth was determined by someone else's assessment, could transform a moment of crisis into an opportunity for growth. The company that had almost lost everything by forgetting the human element was now thriving because of it. Crestline's employee retention had improved by 30%. Client satisfaction scores were at an all-time high, and the Avalon integration was ahead of schedule, in large part because the team Kendrick had built operated on the principle that technology existed to serve people, not the other way around. And the single dad who had almost lost his ability to provide for his daughter had found not just job security, but new purpose, ensuring that the technology they built served the people who used it and the people who created it with equal consideration. He thought about Grandma Lucille, who still cleaned houses at 78 because she said idle hands made for a troubled mind, and who had told him when he called her about the promotion, "Baby, the Lord doesn't waste pain. He turns it into something useful. You just have to be willing to let him work." He thought about Amara, who'd responded to the news of his new title by asking if this meant she could get a puppy, and who had then drawn him a card that said, "Congrats, Dad," with a picture of him sitting at a very large desk surrounded by what appeared to be either stars or cookies. She wouldn't clarify which. And he thought about that Friday morning, standing in a lobby with a box of his belongings and a deactivated badge, watching his career dissolve like sugar in hot water. How the worst moment of his professional life had become the catalyst for everything that followed. Not because the universe owed him a happy ending, but because he'd chosen to meet crisis with clarity, to negotiate from a place of self-worth rather than desperation, and to never forget that his value wasn't determined by a 3-sentence email, but by the relationships he'd built and the knowledge he'd earned through years of showing up and paying attention. In the end, it wasn't just Kendrick who saved Crestline Technologies. It was the recognition that behind every email, every personnel decision, every line of code, and every quarterly projection, there were human lives that mattered. People with daughters who painted coffee mugs and grandmothers who cleaned houses and dreams that deserved to be treated with more respect than a 3-sentence dismissal. A lesson that had transformed not just a company, but everyone within it, starting with a CEO who'd remembered that the foundation of any empire worth building wasn't technology or profit or market share, but the simple, radical act of seeing people as people. And somewhere in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on Langston Avenue, a 10-year-old girl named Amara was practicing her dance moves in the living room. waiting for her father to come home and tell her about his day, confident in the way that only a well-loved child could be that the world was fundamentally good, that hard work mattered, and that her daddy could handle anything. She wasn't wrong.